The Hidden Story by Robert Shearman. She'd always imagined he'd be crushed to death by all those books of his. He had hundreds of them. No, thousands probably. He kept them all in his library, and it really was his library. She had no reason to go in there. She wasn't sure where he got the books from, but if he even so much as went for a walk, he'd come home with bags of the things, and then he'd put them on his shelves, proudly stacking them 2 or 3 books deep, and she felt he enjoyed that stacking just as much as he enjoyed reading them. She'd tell him that sooner or later the shelves would give way, they'd collapse, and he'd be crushed to death by them all. And he'd just smile politely, and he'd say he couldn't imagine a nicer way to go. There weren't many laughs in the house, but plenty of polite smiles. They could certainly stretch to that. He'd say she really ought to give some of his books a try. There were lots of good ones he could recommend her, but she always said no. And after dinner, she'd go and watch television in the sitting room, and he'd go upstairs 1 flight further and read in his library. She'd hear the creak as he sat down in his favorite armchair, and she'd know he'd be settled for hours. And then, when she'd watched enough TV, she'd go and knock on his door, and he'd get up from his chair, put his book back on the shelf, and dutifully follow her to bed. "Good night," he'd say, and "Good night," she'd say, and they'd kiss, and then go back to sleep. Sometimes she'd dream he was crushed by his books. It'd be a nightmare sometimes, and sometimes it'd be really rather reassuring. So when he died quite peacefully in his sleep, and she woke up one morning to find him next to her stiff as a board, the scream she gave was not so much that she was cuddling a corpse, but that he died in completely the wrong way. There wasn't even a book in sight. The children both came to the funeral, and that was nice of them. She knew that they had busy lives of their own. Afterwards, they offered to help her sort through all the husband's things, but she told them there was no need. She was quite capable, thank you. First, she took down all of his old clothes to the charity shop. Then she took down all of his new clothes, too. Might as well, she couldn't see what use she'd have for them now. The man in the charity shop got quite used to her. "Hello again," he'd always say. She asked him whether the shop wanted any books. "Oh yes," said the man, "we're always looking for books." "I'll be back soon," she promised. She soon realized that books were very heavy things. She could carry no more than a dozen at a time, jammed inside old carrier bags. This was going to take forever, she thought, as she waddled her way down the street to Oxfam. It was really thousands, not hundreds, but thousands. And she also thought how lucky she was that he hadn't been crushed by the books after all. They were so heavy it would have made an awful mess. When she lugged into the shop the 6th bag of books, the man was waiting for her. He looked serious. "Can I have a private word?" he asked. He led her to the back and through a door marked "Staff Only." She felt a flutter of fear. Was there something illegal about her husband's books? Were they pornographic? Really, what did she know about what he'd ever got up to in that library? The man closed the door behind them and told her they'd found envelopes tucked inside the books, sealed, addressed to her. "Which books?" she'd asked, a little uselessly, since she didn't know the books. Why did it matter which books? But it felt the right thing to say. It felt she was taking an interest. "Well," he said, and gave a slightly embarrassed laugh. "Well, all of them." She fetched the stepladder from the upstairs cupboard so that she could reach the highest shelves. Then she worked her way through every single book, left to right, A to Z. Sometimes the envelopes were easy to find, right at the front. Others took a little effort, and she had to take the book down and give it a proper search. You'd have it wedged tight between the spines so it wouldn't simply come out with a shake. It might be pressed flat between pages 302 and 303. Each envelope contained a letter. A lot of the letters said the same exact thing. "I love you," in big letters, nothing else, as bold and simple as you'd like. Others made attempt at little poems, or whole sprawling paragraphs in which he tried to explain what he meant by this love. "You're always there for me, I know," read one. "I know it isn't a passionate love, this love of ours, but you're always there for me, and I'm always there for you." One envelope contained an essay so long it took her a whole 20 minutes to read before she tossed it onto the pile with all the others. "I love you," she read. "I love you, so often, so many times, until the word love began to look odd and misspelled through repetition. I do hope you'll read my book someday, just so you realize the way I feel," joked one letter. In another, I love you so much, and I'm so sorry that I need you to read it rather than hear it. I'm so sorry I'm too shy ever to say it out loud. She began on the Monday afternoon. By the weekend, she had finished. The last letter wasn't anything special, stuck inside a Thérèse Raquin by Émile Zola. I love you, it said. Yes, I know, she thought. She walked her way through the love letters that now covered the entire floor, a sea of white broken up by occasional bits of black and blue scribbling. She stepped on them, kicked them aside. She wouldn't read them again. She didn't need them anymore. And when she reached the shelves, she took down the first book that came to hand. She sat in her husband's favorite armchair. It creaked under her weight. And she turned to chapter 1, and she began to read.